Okay, welcome back. This is sort of part two in this sequence. We started with an overview of the interpretation step, and now we're going to focus more in detail or in depth on the aspect or the idea of meaning in translation. So again, meaning is key, this first bullet point, and equivalents are central to translation, right? We can't translate if we don't determine the meaning of the source text, and equivalence is what we're seeking for. We just mentioned in the earlier video that interpretation or determining meaning is a first step, but that it's happening more or less simultaneously as our brain's performing an analysis of those source text factors, whether they're cultural or textual, that are influencing the meaning, the creation of that meaning, and my interpretation of it. So that analysis is happening. We'll see a future video just about analysis. But when it comes to meaning, one sort of provisional definition of meaning we can give, what is meaning when we're talking about translation? It has to do with the combination of several elements, but we could certainly isolate these three: the author's intention, the information conveyed in a text, and the effects of that on the reader. So those three elements at least go into the pot, right? There's no meaning without interpretation. So just the page sitting there, the website, it means nothing until somebody comes along and interprets it. And who does that? Who decides what the text means? That's you, the translator. You can't rely on anybody else. That's your job. You have to read it carefully. You may have to do a little bit of research, but you alone as the translator are tasked in determining what that source text is saying, and then of course moving on through the process to reformulating it or reproducing it as effectively as possible in the target text. When you think about it, that was an oversimplification of meaning. Meaning, unfortunately for us, is an extremely complicated construct encompassing a variety of factors. So, and this is all happening in a culturally specific network. So we have different, I call them factors or contributors to meaning. We have the topic of the text. What's the text about? We have the genre. What type of text is it? What text category does it belong to? We have the author. Is that important? Is it a famous writer? Does this writer have a characteristic style? Or is it more of a corporate kind of generic author? The language, is it Spanish, English, Chinese? What are some of the characteristics of that language? And then how is that language used, the language use? And finally, the reader, the interpreter, the translator in this case. All of these things are working together to create the meaning that we perceive. So it's an extremely, like it says here, complex interaction. To define some of those factors, and it is important that we define them because we'll be using them quite frequently in class. First of all, what's culture? And these are just my definitions that I have culled from other sources. Definitions would be, or culture would be, the values, perspectives, traditions, and products or artifacts of a society. These are transmitted from generation to generation by means of symbolic discourse, such as language. So values, perspectives, traditions, products passed down from generation to generation via language or some other sign system. That's our culture. Genre. Genres are text types whose purpose, topic, focus, audience, organization, register, tone, and style are all determined by genre rules, which we call conventions. Who makes those conventions? Those are the people who maintain that genre, and we call those people a discourse community. More on that in the next video. Content is a no-brainer. That's obvious. That's the message. That's the content. That's what the text is about. It might be a specific domain such as literature or medicine or architecture. Those relate very closely to the content of the text. The author is obviously the creator of the text. So it might be an individual, it might be a literary author, somebody famous, or it might be a collective identity such as a company, right? We think about the status of the author when we talk about their contribution to the meaning of a text. Is the author important? Does it matter who the author is? How important is their identity? How individual is their style, or is it more generic? How important is the author's intention? So when we think about author, there are lots of possible questions and factors that could be important. The reader is the individual, obviously, that reads and interprets the text, the person to whom or the people to whom it is directed. So we have to think about what are the expectations of those readers, what are some of their cultural frames, what biases might they have, and things like that. Again, these are all factors that affect the meaning of texts. Our brains recognize these things. We do it without thinking, but what we're doing is kind of slowing down our analysis to slow motion. Language is a rule-governed system of human communication. It's a good definition. And it consists of things like sounds, grammar structures, right? Morphemes, right? Syntactic structures, rules for combining phrases and clauses and sentences. It also consists, obviously, of lexical items, so words, phrases, idioms, and things like that. Those are the words on the page. Language use is what I call the way in which a particular text actually uses those linguistic resources. So the words, the grammar structures, the sounds, how are those put together? That's language use. So in this category, I put things like style, register, degree of formality, the tone, the attitude that that language projects. The language variety, is it a particular dialect? Is it a particular jargon? And the way the text is organized. These are all products of the way an author or a particular text might deploy language. So we can sort of categorize all of these different, what did I call them? Factors into two broad dimensions. We have the extralinguistic. Extra just means beyond, so the beyond language dimension, the cultural dimension, and then we have the textual or the linguistic dimension, which are the words on the page. In the cultural or extralinguistic dimension, we have those broad sociocultural norms and expectations that all of the speakers of a language in a particular area will share and understand. We have the purpose of the text, different situational factors like who's the author, who are the readers, what are their expectations, in what time and place is this exchange, right? The writing and the reading of the text taking place, or the speaking and the listening of that utterance, right? So those situational factors come into play. They're not necessarily linguistic, but they affect meaning. And then we've talked about the three primary language functions: informative, vocative, and expressive. So those are some things that aren't made out of words and grammar, but that nonetheless are cultural dimensions or extralinguistic dimensions of meaning that affect how we might interpret a text. And then on the other side, we do have the linguistic, the strictly textual dimension of meaning, right? Those are the sounds, if I'm speaking, what you're hearing right now, the lexical items, the words, the phrases that someone might say or write, and the language structures that you have to use when you're speaking or writing in a particular language. So the textual or linguistic dimension is quite literally the words on the page. And so this also includes, when you're looking at a text, whether you're interpreting it or translating it, reformulating it, the products of language use that I mentioned on the previous slide, right? Language variety, register, tone, style, the way the text is organized, how many paragraphs does it have? Are those in a particular order? How well are they connected? Pragmatics, which has to do with the influence of context on the interpretation of a written or spoken message. And then finally, culturally specific connections between reality and language forms. So again, this is a lot of words on a slide, but the takeaway should be that meaning is incredibly complex. It's culturally specific, it's language specific, and our brains take into consideration almost intuitively or instinctually all of these many factors. But when we're doing a translation, we need to slow it down, almost go into slow motion mode, and think about each of these things more purposefully, more intentionally. All right, now we're on to our next topic. So I'm going to leave it there. There was a lot of information in this video, even though it's short, so I encourage you to maybe rewind and review and make sure you're familiar with how complex language is or meaning is, what was my definition of meaning that I threw out earlier, and then are you familiar with the definitions, and do you understand these various different aspects that I'm talking about affecting the meaning of a text that we might interpret or reformulate? That's it.